Imagine a secret so tightly kept that even the most loyal staff at the palace couldn't speak about it. Imagine whispers in hallways, tension so thick it could be cut with a knife, and a young life at the center of a storm no one outside the royal bubble could even begin to imagine. What if someone who had been on the inside finally decided to break that silence? And not just in passing, not just casually, but in a way that could shock the world? That someone exists. And they're finally telling everything they've seen, everything they've lived through, everything they've been forced to keep quiet about for years. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. The ex-nanny, the one responsible for the daily care of a little prince, let's call him Archie for context, has stepped forward. And from the very first moment, she made it clear, the story is not what it seems. She doesn't just speak about mundane baby routines or cute moments captured in photo ops. No, she speaks about secrets, inconsistencies, and the contradictions between public statements and private reality. And let me tell you, what she reveals in her first few words is enough to make anyone stop in their tracks. You might be wondering, why now? Why after all these years does she decide to come forward? That's the first layer of intrigue. You see, for years she watched from the background, invisible to cameras, largely unheard by the world. She observed dynamics that no one else could, overheard conversations that painted a picture far different from what tabloids or official statements suggested. And as time passed, the weight of her silence grew heavier and heavier. Imagine carrying a truth like that, the kind that could shift public perception entirely, and knowing you could not speak. That's the burden she carried. Her story begins with the earliest days of her employment. A young woman, bright-eyed, full of passion, eager to make a difference in a child's life, entering what seemed like a dream job. A position that, on the surface, promised love, stability, and closeness to one of the most photographed families in the world. But almost immediately, she sensed a disconnect between what was presented publicly and what was actually happening behind closed doors. Tiny contradictions, small inconsistencies. A joke that didn't land, a gesture that seemed off, a routine that was rehearsed for cameras rather than natural. Most people might have brushed it off, but she couldn't, because she was responsible for a child's daily life, every diaper change, every feeding, every nap, every small, intimate moment. And those moments, she realized, were often staged or manipulated for appearances. She recalls one incident in particular that stuck with her. A moment so ordinary on the surface, yet, when pieced together later, revealed an entirely different reality. It was a simple lunch in the nursery. Archie, still toddling, reaching for his food. Everything seemed normal, but then she noticed subtle signs. A hesitation in how he reached for the spoon, the nervous glance from one of the aides, and a whispered instruction that the cameras should avoid this shot. At that instant, she realized. Even the smallest moments were curated, choreographed, and controlled. Nothing here was accidental. Nothing here was purely natural. And that realization began to open her eyes to the layers of performance surrounding the child she cared for so deeply. What followed was a series of revelations that would challenge anyone's understanding of privilege, image, and secrecy. She describes an environment where rules were flexible, but only in ways that suited optics. Decisions that should have been simple, bedtime routines, meal choices, outdoor play, were often overridden by a desire to look right in photos, in media releases, or for visiting dignitaries. Every staff member had to navigate not just the child's needs, but the expectations of the household, which were often at odds. And in that tension, she saw cracks, moments of genuine vulnerability, but also moments of strain, frustration, and even fear. And here's where it gets even more intense. She begins to hint at events that had never made it into the press, incidents that, if revealed publicly, could force people to rethink everything they thought they knew. She doesn't go into specifics yet, teasing only enough to ignite curiosity, describing her anxiety over whether the world was ready to hear what she had to say. Some truths, she explains, are too heavy to carry alone, but too dangerous to speak lightly. That's when you realize. This is not just a story about daily life as a nanny. This is a story about what it means to live in a world where image and reality diverge, and where a child's life is woven into a narrative much larger than they could ever comprehend. The tension builds further as she recounts moments of isolation, the strange etiquette of palace life, the expectations that came with the title, and the unspoken rules that governed everyone's behavior. She paints a picture of a delicate balance. On one side, the love and care of a child, and on the other, the pressures, the scrutiny, and the performance required to maintain an image. And in that space, small dramas unfolded daily, ones that the public would never see. She explains how even the most innocent requests, a toy, a snack, a walk in the garden, could spiral into minor crises if they didn't align with the household's orchestrated routine. And yet, amid all the chaos, there were moments of tenderness. Moments that reminded her why she took the job in the first place. A quiet laugh with the child, a shared understanding, a fleeting sense of normalcy. But those moments were fleeting, often overshadowed by the demands of appearances and protocol. And as she reflects on those bittersweet experiences, she asks herself, and the audience, how much of what we see in public can ever be trusted? How much of the joy, the drama, the smiles we see on camera are real, and how much are carefully staged illusions? She also touches on her relationships with other staff members. Some were loyal, some cautious, some fearful, and some outright manipulative. Alliances formed and dissolved in whispers. Trust was a rare commodity, and in navigating these dynamics, she had to make decisions every day that weighed the child's well-being against the pressures from the higher-ups. She describes the constant calculation, when to intervene, when to observe, when to protect, and when to comply. It was a tightrope walk, and one misstep could mean losing her position, or worse, compromising the child's care. And this is where the story begins to take a turn toward revelation. She starts to hint at the things she saw that contradicted the stories presented publicly. Not scandalous for shock value, but meaningful for understanding the truth behind the image. The contradictions she observed, subtle, hidden, but undeniable, laid the foundation for the revelations she is about to share. And as she speaks, you sense a tension building, a storm quietly gathering on the horizon. She is preparing the audience for the truth, one carefully measured step at a time. By the end of this introduction, the audience is left with several questions that demand answers. What exactly did she witness behind closed doors? How did those experiences shape her perspective? And what compelled her to finally speak out now, after years of silence? The stage is set. The emotional and dramatic groundwork is laid. And just when you think the story might settle into a predictable rhythm, she drops a hint that what comes next will be far more revealing than anything she's said so far. But what came next, she teases, would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The introduction closes on this cliffhanger, leaving viewers on the edge of their seats, desperate to know the specifics, curious about the tension and mystery, and emotionally invested in the ex-nanny's narrative. By now, the audience feels connected to her, invested in her credibility, and eager for the unfolding chapters, ready for each revelation to peel back another layer of the world behind the public facade. The curiosity gap is perfectly in place. The audience wants to see what has been hidden, what truths have been kept secret, and how they might challenge everything they believed about the public story. And with this foundation, the path is clear for the first chapter, where we dive into her earliest days, the first signs that something was different, and the moments that would ultimately set her on the path to speaking out. Section complete. Have you ever stepped into a place thinking it would be a dream, only to realize that behind the polished surface, something felt off? That's exactly what our ex-nanny experienced on her first day. Picture it. A bright morning, crisp air, the excitement of beginning a career that promised closeness with a young royal child, and an opportunity most could only dream of. She thought she was walking into a world of warmth, laughter, and learning. Instead, she stepped into a carefully controlled environment where every action was observed, every smile measured, and every gesture calculated. She remembers that first morning vividly, the gates gleaming under the sunlight, and the soft hum of staff moving like clockwork in the background. At first glance, everything seemed perfect. The nursery was immaculate, toys neatly arranged, and an air of order that suggested competence and care. Yet, almost immediately, she noticed tiny, subtle details that hinted at an underlying tension. A staff member's nervous glance, A whispered correction that didn't seem necessary. Instructions being given in hushed tones, as if speaking too loudly could disrupt some invisible balance. She recalls her first meeting with the household manager. Polite, professional, but with an intensity that made her stomach tighten. "We run a very specific operation here," the manager said, smiling, yet with eyes that seemed to scan every inch of the room. "Everything matters, from the timing of a nap to the placement of a spoon. Nothing is accidental." At the time, she assumed this was standard procedure, perhaps the formality of royal life. But as days passed, she realized this was no ordinary protocol. It was a meticulous orchestration designed to maintain appearances and control narratives. From the very first week, she saw contradictions between the stories told publicly and the private reality. A playful photo op might require hours of preparation and rehearsed smiles. A seemingly innocent outing in the garden was sometimes carefully timed around cameras. She quickly understood that her role wasn't just to care for the child. It was to participate in a larger performance, one that demanded vigilance, adaptability, and discretion. Her days were long, filled with routines that seemed straightforward, yet were layered with hidden complexities. Feeding times, diaper changes, and play sessions all came with an invisible checklist: who was observing, who was recording, and what image needed to be projected. She noticed how the child responded not just to her, but to the subtle cues from the surrounding adults. A glance here, a touch there. The child was learning early that behavior could influence the mood of the room, and that small actions could ripple through the carefully maintained order. But the reality wasn't just about rules and structure. There were moments of tension that caught her off guard. Staff arguing quietly in corridors, whispers about mistakes that could never be repeated, and moments where even the smallest misstep felt consequential. She recalls vividly a day when a toy was misplaced. It was harmless, ordinary even. Yet the reaction from the senior aide was disproportionate, a mix of frustration and panic that seemed completely unrelated to the situation. Later, she understood. Every small detail mattered because everything could be scrutinized, misinterpreted, or used as leverage. Despite the intensity, she also witnessed moments of warmth. Brief flashes of genuine interaction between the child and the parents, smiles shared in private, laughter that wasn't for the cameras. These moments reminded her why she had taken the job in the first place. They were fleeting, but they were real, glimpses of normalcy in a highly controlled environment. And yet, those glimpses were shadowed by a constant sense of observation, a reminder that nothing could exist in isolation from the household's overarching demands. The ex-nanny also quickly became aware of the complex social dynamics among staff members. Alliances formed quietly, rivalries simmered beneath polite smiles, and loyalty was constantly tested. Some staff were protective of the child, while others seemed more concerned with maintaining favor with higher-ups. She learned fast that trust was a rare commodity, and misjudging someone's intentions could have serious consequences. In this environment, she had to navigate not just childcare, but diplomacy, intuition, and constant vigilance. Early on, she observed incidents that would later stick in her mind as crucial signs. A small disagreement over scheduling, which should have been trivial, escalated into a tension-filled moment that revealed deeper patterns. She began documenting, mentally at first, then physically, noting inconsistencies between what she was told, what she witnessed, and what was presented publicly. These early observations were the seeds of the revelations she would eventually share. They were subtle, often overlooked, but in hindsight, they were the first cracks in the carefully constructed facade. She also describes the pressure of discretion. Every day, she was reminded, subtly but unmistakably, that she could not share what she saw with outsiders. Staff were warned, not in overt threats, but in careful language about loyalty, discretion, and the importance of protecting the family's image. She felt the weight of these expectations immediately. One wrong comment, one slip of information, and she could face consequences that were unclear, but undoubtedly severe. It was an invisible cage, built from the very instructions meant to guide her. And then there were moments that bordered on surreal. Ordinary caregiving tasks could suddenly turn into high-stakes scenarios simply because someone with influence decided it was necessary. A nap time, for instance, could become a rehearsal of patience, negotiation, and strategic compliance, all designed to maintain harmony and present the appearance of effortless control. She explains how exhausting it was to maintain vigilance constantly, balancing the child's needs with the household's invisible rules. Yet amid all the challenges, she formed a bond with the child. It was subtle, quiet, but undeniable. The child trusted her in ways others did not, sought comfort in her presence, and responded to her guidance with affection. And that bond, she emphasizes, became both her strength and her vulnerability. The more she cared, the more she felt the pressure of secrecy, the weight of the household's expectations, and the tension of knowing truths that could never be spoken. As the first weeks unfolded, the ex-nanny began piecing together patterns. She noticed the repetition of certain behaviors, the controlled nature of public appearances, and the small inconsistencies that hinted at a larger story. She began to understand the delicate balance between private truth and public image. A balance that could tip at any moment, with consequences she could only imagine. And that brings us to the first real shock she hints at, a moment when she realized that even the most seemingly ordinary days were layered with hidden meaning. Something happened, she doesn't reveal it fully yet, that made her question not just her role, but the entire household's priorities. It was small, almost trivial in isolation, yet when she considered its implications, it revealed a level of orchestration and control that was both fascinating and alarming. By the end of this chapter, the audience should be feeling a mixture of intrigue and tension. They understand the environment, highly controlled, subtly tense, and emotionally complex. They are invested in the ex-nanny's perspective and curious about the events she has hinted at. And, just as importantly, they are left with the first major cliffhanger. What exactly happened during that early incident that first made her question everything? She ends the chapter teasing the next revelation. I thought I understood what it meant to care for a child in the royal household, but what I saw next would shatter all of my assumptions. And it began on a day that seemed like any other. Have you ever wondered what life is really like behind palace walls? Not the glittering events, not the photo ops or the headlines, but the quiet, unspoken reality that exists when the cameras are gone and the world is watching only through carefully curated images? That's exactly what our ex-nanny experienced in her second week, and what she reveals will make you question everything you think you know about life in the household. She begins by describing the initial shock of learning the invisible rules that governed every movement, every interaction, every moment of the day. Some rules were practical, schedules for meals, nap times, hygiene routines. Others, however, were entirely unspoken yet strictly enforced, shaping not only behavior but thought patterns, perceptions, and even the child's understanding of the world. She recalls thinking, I knew there were guidelines, but I never realized how deeply they ran. How controlling, how strategic, and how relentless they could be. The first thing she noticed was the rhythm of the household. Everything moved like clockwork, but the clock was invisible, and no one ever explained it outright. Meals had to be timed precisely, not just for the child, but to accommodate visitors, staff rotations, and media opportunities. Playtime had to be structured to balance learning, entertainment, and the optics of joy. Even a simple walk in the garden was calculated. Which routes were visible to the cameras, which angles would make the child look cheerful, which gestures would make the household appear harmonious. It wasn't just about appearances for the outside world. It was about control within the household. Staff were acutely aware that any deviation could ripple outward. A minor misstep could escalate, turning into whispered warnings, subtle reprimands, or strained glances that reminded everyone of their place. The ex-nanny recalls vividly her first encounter with one of these situations, a disagreement over how to handle a tantrum. What seemed like a normal parental challenge became a delicate negotiation among adults who were constantly aware of optics, hierarchy, and hidden agendas. She emphasizes how these rules weren't documented, weren't written down, but were enforced with near-ritual precision. If you broke one, accidentally, out of necessity, or in a moment of human error, there would be consequences. Not overt threats, but tension, coldness, and judgment. She learned quickly that understanding these invisible rules was critical to survival. And more importantly, She realized that even the child, in their own way, was learning them too. Every glance, every smile, every request for comfort had to be weighed against the unseen expectations of the adults around them. The ex-nanny provides an analogy to help the audience grasp the intensity. Imagine playing a game where the rules constantly shift and the stakes are incredibly high. You never get to see the full rulebook. You have to infer, adapt, and anticipate every move, all while managing your own emotions and the emotions of a young child entirely dependent on you. That's the environment she stepped into, and it was exhausting, emotionally and mentally, from day one. She then delves into the emotional toll these hidden rules took on her. Staff relationships were complicated, fraught with tension. Some staff were fiercely loyal to the family, always vigilant, sometimes paranoid. Others were resigned, doing what they could to survive the day without conflict. And some played subtle games of influence, offering information selectively to maintain favor. Navigating this web required constant observation, intuition, and sometimes deception. She recounts moments when she had to carefully choose her words, body language, and actions to avoid drawing negative attention, even when she was simply trying to do her job. One story she shares involves a minor disagreement over the child's bedtime routine. What seemed like a harmless variation in timing became a prolonged discussion among the aides and senior staff. Every decision was scrutinized. Would this reflect poorly on someone? Could this minor choice create a ripple of consequences later? The ex-nanny recalls feeling trapped between her responsibility to the child and her responsibility to the household hierarchy. It was a balancing act that required constant negotiation and careful judgment, a theme she would encounter repeatedly in the weeks and months to come. She also touches on the psychological pressure. Even when alone with the child, she felt watched, assessed, evaluated. There were subtle signs. Cameras in strategic places, aides observing from a distance, whispered comments that indicated mistakes were noticed. This created a dual reality. On the surface, she was simply caring for a child. Underneath, she was navigating a landscape of constant evaluation. And it wasn't just about her. The child absorbed these cues too, learning to adapt, anticipate, and sometimes mask feelings to fit expectations. Amid this tension, she found moments of clarity. Times when the child's personality shone through unfiltered. A genuine laugh, an unprompted display of affection, a spontaneous reaction to play. These moments were precious and grounding, reminding her of why she had taken the job despite the pressure. But she also knew that even these moments could be manipulated if noticed by the wrong person or the cameras. She describes the constant vigilance required to protect the child's innocence while complying with the rules of the household. The ex-nanny also hints at incidents that would later form the core of her revelations. She speaks of small contradictions, brief moments when what she saw didn't align with what was publicly portrayed. She doesn't go into full detail yet, but she teases the audience with lines like, "Some moments are harmless on the surface, but when you know the context, they tell a very different story." These early glimpses set the stage for the more dramatic disclosures that will come later. By the end of this chapter, the audience should feel both tension and intrigue. They understand the hidden complexities of the household, the unspoken rules, and the constant balance between care, observation, and performance. They are beginning to see how a young child, a devoted caregiver, and a tightly controlled environment intersect in ways that are emotionally and psychologically intense. And just when the reader thinks they have a handle on the environment, she drops the first real cliffhanger, an incident involving a seemingly minor event that exposed just how fragile the balance truly was. She ends the chapter with a teasing line. "I thought I understood the rules, but what happened next would shatter my assumptions entirely and reveal a side of this world that no one outside could have imagined." Have you ever felt that tingling sense in the pit of your stomach? The one that screams something is off, even when everything looks normal. That's exactly what our ex-nanny experienced during what seemed like an ordinary day. But in hindsight, she knew it was a turning point, the first red flag that revealed the hidden layers of tension, control, and secrecy surrounding the household and the child she cared for. It started with something simple, a routine morning feeding. Archie, playful and curious as always, was reaching for his breakfast while the ex-nanny attempted to introduce a new learning activity, a small game designed to stimulate cognitive development. On any other day, this would have been ordinary, the sort of thing a nanny does every day. But that morning, she noticed subtle signals that something was different. The aide supervising from the doorway was unusually tense, eyes darting back and forth. A whispered instruction reached her ears, telling her to keep the child in a specific position, a request that made no sense for safety or learning purposes. She recounts the moment vividly, the sensation of being watched not just physically, but psychologically. There was an underlying pressure, a demand that every action aligned perfectly with unseen expectations. Even a small deviation, reaching for the spoon with the left hand instead of the right, adjusting a napkin slightly off-center, was observed, evaluated, and silently judged. She realized in that instant that the child's environment was meticulously orchestrated, and she was an active participant in maintaining that facade. As the day unfolded, more oddities appeared. A scheduled walk in the garden, normally a time for fresh air and freedom, became a lesson in subtle control. The path had to be followed precisely, the child's gestures and interactions monitored for camera angles or aesthetic considerations, and even her own movements scrutinized. She describes the psychological toll, a growing awareness that every decision, however minor, was layered with consequences she could neither predict nor fully understand. Then came the first incident that truly set her nerves on edge. During a routine diaper change, the child displayed a minor frustration, a squirming movement that any caregiver would expect. Instead of handling it with the usual patience, a senior aide intervened abruptly, scolding the nanny quietly but firmly, insisting she correct the behavior immediately. The ex-nanny felt a wave of confusion. The correction was unnecessary for the child's development, unnecessary for discipline, but it seemed to serve a different purpose. Maintaining appearances, ensuring consistency, and demonstrating control. She reflects on this event with a mixture of frustration and realization. At that moment, she understood that ordinary caregiving tasks were layered with a performative element. The rules weren't about child development alone. They were about optics, hierarchy, and the subtle orchestration of public perception. She began to see patterns. Moments that seemed benign often carried hidden meanings, and small actions could trigger disproportionate responses. What followed over the next few weeks cemented her sense that something larger was at play. She noticed subtle inconsistencies between what she was told and what actually occurred. For instance, requests for specific routines often conflicted with practical needs. Guidance from aides sometimes contradicted previous instructions, creating confusion and tension. She began mentally cataloging these instances, realizing that the surface-level harmony of the household masked a complex web of control, manipulation, and unseen agendas. The ex-nanny also observed emotional cues from the child that puzzled her. Archie displayed a heightened awareness of adult moods, responding not just to her guidance, but to the unspoken tension in the room. His reactions suggested that he was learning to navigate an environment where emotions were tightly monitored, and responses could influence outcomes. She explains the subtle tragedy of this, a child's natural instincts tempered by the awareness that behavior could carry consequences, not just from parents, but from the network of staff orchestrating the household. Humor, she notes, became a coping mechanism. Amid tension, small moments of levity offered relief. A shared smile, a playful gesture, a soft laugh. Yet even these moments were tinged with anxiety. Could they be misinterpreted? Could someone see them as improper or disruptive? The nanny learned to navigate the delicate balance between nurturing natural joy and maintaining the invisible rules of the household. One of the most striking aspects of this early period was how quickly she realized the extent of secrecy. Information was compartmentalized. Staff were given only pieces of the puzzle. Decisions were communicated selectively, often in private whispers, so that no one person held full knowledge of what was happening. She likens it to walking through a maze in the dark, aware that a wrong turn could have ripple effects, yet never seeing the whole path. By now, the audience begins to sense the tension, the subtle dread building behind the polished appearances. The ex-nanny crafts this experience with dramatic pauses, short, punchy lines to convey urgency, and longer reflective sentences to immerse the viewer in the emotional landscape. She asks direct questions. Have you ever felt trapped in a system where following the rules still leaves you uncertain? Where the stakes are invisible but unforgiving? These rhetorical questions deepen engagement, making viewers feel connected to her perspective. And then, the first true mystery emerges. She describes an event that, on the surface, appeared ordinary, a scheduled visit from a distant relative, or perhaps a routine inspection of the nursery. But in hindsight, she noticed anomalies, a sudden change in the child's schedule, unexplained instructions to staff, and subtle shifts in the adult's behavior. The clues didn't make sense at the time, but they hinted at a deeper narrative, one that she would gradually uncover as her tenure continued. The chapter escalates as she recounts a critical moment, a situation in which she had to make a decision on her own, balancing the child's well-being against the invisible rules and pressures of the household. It was a moment of courage, but also one of fear. Her actions could have consequences she could not predict, and the weight of responsibility pressed down with every second. By the end of Chapter 3, the audience should feel fully immersed in the tension, the subtle drama, and the underlying mystery. They understand that what appears ordinary is anything but. The stage is set for the revelations to come, and viewers are primed for the deeper secrets she will uncover. The chapter closes with a cliffhanger, teasing the next major revelation. I thought I had seen the first cracks in the system, but what came next was something I never expected. And it would change how I viewed everything I had witnessed. No one outside could have guessed what happened that day. Have you ever caught a glimpse of something that didn't quite fit? A detail so small that most people would overlook it, but your instincts scream that it matters? That's exactly how our ex-nanny began to notice the first real cracks in the carefully curated image of the household. She describes it as a slow, almost imperceptible awakening, a process of seeing beyond the polished surface to the patterns and secrets that existed in plain sight. It started with small, seemingly insignificant moments. A whispered conversation in a hallway, a nervous glance exchanged between aides, or an unusual instruction about a minor detail, like how a toy was placed or how the child's blanket was folded. On the surface, these details seemed trivial, even mundane. But over time, she noticed that these small, controlled moments were part of a much larger system, one that governed not only daily life, but the perceptions of those who would eventually see the child through photos, media, and carefully released anecdotes. She recalls one specific morning that stands out vividly. Archie was playing with a new toy, a simple activity in any ordinary household. Yet even this simple moment was orchestrated in ways that she would only later come to fully understand. An aide positioned the child so that light from the window would illuminate his face perfectly for a brief photo opportunity. The timing of each movement was subtly influenced by an unseen schedule. The ex-nanny realized, almost in disbelief, that the child's playtime, something so naturally innocent, was being manipulated for optics. The realization sent a shiver down her spine. She began to understand that nothing was truly spontaneous, and that the child's world, even at this tender age, was being subtly choreographed. But the moments she observed were not all benign. There were subtle tensions, inconsistencies, and unspoken hierarchies that influenced every interaction. She recounts an instance when a staff member suddenly changed the child's routine without explanation. The reaction from senior aides was immediate and tense. Not because the child was harmed, but because the deviation disrupted the carefully maintained system. The ex-nanny began to recognize a pattern. Small incidents were never truly small. Each acted as a signal, a ripple through a network of hidden expectations that only insiders could understand. What made this even more emotionally complex was the child's awareness. Archie, according to the nanny, began responding not just to her guidance, but to subtle emotional cues from the adults around him. If there was tension between aides, if instructions were whispered rather than spoken aloud, if gestures were slightly off, he noticed. The child's reactions were instinctive yet profound. He was learning early on how to navigate a world layered with invisible rules. The ex-nanny describes the bittersweet nature of this. A child's intelligence and adaptability, growing in an environment where innocence was quietly constrained by the pressures of optics and performance. She also began to observe the social dynamics among staff in more detail. Some aides were protective, almost fiercely so, ensuring that the child's needs were prioritized over optics. Others were compliant to the point of fear, meticulously following instructions even when they seemed absurd. And a few were manipulators, subtly influencing situations to gain favor or control outcomes. Navigating these dynamics became a daily challenge, requiring vigilance, intuition, and constant adjustment. One of the most striking incidents she recounts involves a minor conflict between two aides over scheduling. The disagreement was brief but intense, and it revealed the invisible tensions underpinning daily operations. The ex-nanny was caught in the middle, forced to mediate without making waves. She describes the feeling as walking a tightrope over a pit of unseen dangers. Every word mattered. Every gesture could tip the balance. And amid this tension, the child remained central, yet shielded, unaware of the invisible pressures shaping each interaction. Amid these challenges, she notes moments of emotional intensity that surprised her. A sudden laugh, an unprompted display of affection, or a small act of creativity from the child would remind her of why she was there. These moments were fleeting, yet powerful, a glimpse of normalcy in a world that was otherwise governed by rules she could not always explain. She reflects on the contrast, the warmth of genuine human connection versus the rigidity of the environment. These dualities, she realized, defined her experience in ways she would only fully understand in hindsight. She also begins to hint at incidents that would later become key points in her revelations. She speaks of contradictions between what was said publicly and what occurred privately. Stories about routines, playful moments, or the child's behavior often did not align with what she observed. These early observations planted the seeds of doubt, questions, and curiosity that would later drive her to speak out. She teases the audience with lines like, "At the time, I thought I was imagining things. But looking back, the truth was hiding in plain sight all along." Humor and levity became essential tools for her sanity. She recounts small private jokes with the child, playful interactions that reminded her of the innocence at the center of her role. Yet even these moments carried an undercurrent of anxiety. Could they be misunderstood? Could someone see them as improper? The tension was constant, and she had to learn how to protect those fleeting moments while complying with the broader rules of the household. By the end of Chapter 4, the audience begins to see the complexity and emotional depth of the environment. They understand that ordinary moments were often layered with hidden meaning, that the child was learning subtle lessons about observation and compliance, and that the ex-nanny's role was far more complicated than simple caregiving. The tension is palpable, the intrigue high, and the curiosity gap wide open. The chapter closes with a cliffhanger that sets the stage for the next phase of the story, a dramatic incident that shifts her perception of the household entirely. She leaves viewers hanging with the line, "I thought I had understood the hidden rules, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened next, a moment that would force me to question everything I believed about the world I had entered." Have you ever experienced a moment that seemed ordinary at first, only to realize later that it was a turning point, something that would change your perception of everything you thought you knew? That's exactly what happened to our ex-nanny during her first few months on the job. A day that began like any other quickly turned into an event that would forever alter her understanding of the household, the dynamics at play, and the child's world. It started with a routine schedule: breakfast, playtime, and a short outing in the garden. Archie was cheerful, engaging with his toys, and the staff around him were performing their duties in the usual synchronized rhythm. But then, a small change, seemingly insignificant, set off a chain reaction. A last-minute adjustment to the child's playtime schedule was made by a senior aide, without explanation. On any other day, this might have gone unnoticed, but the ex-nanny immediately sensed something unusual. She describes the subtle shifts in behavior that followed. Aide interactions became tense, instructions were whispered, and the atmosphere seemed charged with unspoken urgency. Even the child, who was usually oblivious to such tensions, seemed to pick up on the subtle changes in tone and energy. She recalls feeling a sense of foreboding, an intuitive awareness that something was happening behind the scenes, something that she had not been fully informed about. The first hint of the day's significance came when the child, in his playful curiosity, tried to explore a part of the garden that was usually off-limits. What followed was not a reprimand or a gentle correction, but a flurry of orchestrated responses. Staff converged, subtly redirecting the child's movements, adjusting props, and communicating in hushed tones with gestures and glances. The ex-nanny realized then that even this small act of curiosity was being carefully managed, not for the child's safety, but to maintain a particular order and image. As the morning progressed, small anomalies accumulated. An aide's whispered instructions contradicted the previous plan. A photographer, apparently on site for routine documentation, seemed unusually attentive to specific angles and expressions, and the child's reactions, instinctive as they were, began to reveal his growing awareness of the pressures around him. He paused, looked towards certain adults for guidance, and adjusted his behavior accordingly. The ex-nanny notes this moment with a mix of admiration and concern. Here was a young child, already learning the subtle language of compliance, observation, and expectation. The incident reached its peak during what should have been a simple playtime. Archie was engaging with a new toy, an interactive set meant to stimulate creativity. Suddenly, a minor spill occurred, a moment so ordinary it would have passed unnoticed in any other household. But in this environment, the spill became a focal point. Senior aides responded immediately, directing the ex-nanny in a manner that was precise, urgent, and laden with unspoken meaning. The child's play was interrupted, not by accident or misbehavior, but by the invisible currents of control that governed every movement. The ex-nanny recalls feeling her heart race. She had seen tensions before, small inconsistencies and subtle cues, but never to this extent. She began to understand the weight of the hidden rules, the delicate balance that dictated every action, and the incredible vigilance required to navigate them successfully. At the same time, she noticed the child's response, a fleeting look of confusion, a pause in movement, a subtle attempt to gauge the reactions of the adults around him. In that moment, she realized just how deeply the child was affected by the unseen pressures of the household. And then came the conversation that changed everything. She was pulled aside by a senior aide, in private, and instructed, carefully, almost cryptically, about how to handle the remainder of the day. It was not just about correcting a behavior or following a protocol. It was about managing perception, maintaining order, and ensuring that no external observer could ever question the household's control. The ex-nanny recalls feeling both frustration and awe at the complexity. The child's life, her duties, and the entire environment were intertwined in ways she had never imagined. She begins to reflect on the emotional impact of the incident. It was exhausting, both mentally and emotionally, to balance caregiving with the invisible orchestration required. She found herself constantly anticipating the next instruction, evaluating the child's responses, and considering how every action could ripple through the household's carefully managed system. Even small moments of normal interaction required strategic thought and careful timing. The weight of responsibility was overwhelming, and she realized that this was only the beginning of what she would witness in the weeks and months to come. One of the most striking aspects of this day, she explains, was the lesson it provided about the invisible structure of the household. Nothing was left to chance. Every detail, from playtime to meals to rest periods, was meticulously calculated to maintain order, control, and the appearance of harmony. She began to see patterns she had not noticed before. Moments that seemed trivial were part of a larger choreography, designed to influence behavior, perception, and outcomes. And yet, amid the tension, there were moments of resilience. The child, despite the subtle pressures around him, displayed intelligence, adaptability, and charm. He responded not just to her guidance, but to the nuances of the environment with remarkable sensitivity. She recounts moments of genuine connection, a laugh shared in secrecy, a playful glance, or a spontaneous act of affection that reminded her of the innocence at the center of her role. These fleeting moments were precious, grounding her in her purpose, and reminding her why she had chosen this path despite the hidden complexities. By the end of this chapter, the audience should feel the dramatic tension fully established. They see the stakes clearly: the child's development, the household's control, and the ex-nanny's delicate position all intersect in a high-pressure environment. They are primed for the deeper revelations to come, the incidents that will expose more of the hidden reality behind closed doors. The chapter concludes with a cliffhanger that hints at the next major revelation. I thought I understood the rules, the hidden pressures, and the delicate balance of my role, but nothing could have prepared me for what I discovered later that week. It was a secret that would make me question everything I had believed about this world, and it began with a small, seemingly harmless moment that no one else noticed. Have you ever wondered who truly wields power behind the scenes? Not the people whose names appear in public announcements, not the ones posing for photos, but the individuals whose influence shapes daily life without anyone outside noticing? Our ex-nanny quickly discovered that within this household, control wasn't straightforward. It wasn't just about parents or public perception. It was about a complex, hidden hierarchy among staff, one that dictated routines, behavior, and even the child's emotional environment. She describes her first realization of this hidden structure. On a typical morning, she was preparing Archie for breakfast while senior aides coordinated behind the scenes. At first glance, the aides appeared equal in rank, but subtle cues, the way instructions were given, the body language, and the careful observation of each action, revealed a strict internal order. Some staff members wielded power not because of official titles, but because of their influence over routines, their knowledge of secrets, and their ability to anticipate parental expectations. One aide, whom she refers to as the gatekeeper, held immense sway. This person controlled access to information, decided which incidents were reported upward, and subtly influenced the behavior of other staff. She noticed that even minor decisions required approval from the gatekeeper. From how meals were served to how playtime unfolded, it became clear that the child's daily life, though guided by love and care, was also subject to the invisible hand of this internal hierarchy. The ex-nanny recounts her first direct encounter with this hierarchy. She had adjusted a minor routine to accommodate the child's needs, thinking it was a small, reasonable change. Immediately, a senior aide intervened, not with anger, but with precision. A calm, calculated series of instructions that corrected her actions and reinforced the gatekeeper's authority. She realized then that every decision was layered, with consequences she had not fully grasped. The lesson was clear. In this household, power was subtle, distributed, and enforced through observation, social dynamics, and unspoken rules. She also noticed how staff relationships were carefully managed. Alliances formed naturally. Some aides aligned closely with the gatekeeper, others with the parents' preferences, while rivalries simmered quietly. She describes a situation in which two aides disagreed over the child's nap schedule. What seemed like a minor conflict escalated into a delicate negotiation, with the ex-nanny caught in the middle, forced to mediate between competing loyalties. Every word, gesture, and decision mattered. Even a small mistake could shift the balance of influence. Humor and camaraderie, she explains, existed but were carefully measured. Moments of levity had to be subtle, coded almost, so as not to appear unprofessional or disrupt the invisible order. She recounts small, quiet jokes shared with the child, fleeting, precious, yet conducted in a way that ensured no outside eyes could misinterpret them. These moments served as both a release valve and a reminder of the human connection at the heart of her role. The hierarchy also affected the child in ways she initially didn't recognize. Archie, perceptive beyond his years, responded to staff dynamics instinctively. He observed tension, picked up on subtle cues, and adjusted his behavior accordingly. The ex-nanny describes feeling both admiration and concern. On one hand, his awareness was remarkable. On the other, it reflected the early imposition of social structures and pressures that no ordinary child should have to navigate. She recounts an instance that revealed the full complexity of the hierarchy. A seemingly trivial decision, how to handle a spilled drink, became a test of loyalty, judgment, and subtle influence. The aide in charge corrected her actions with precise instructions, reinforcing the gatekeeper's authority and subtly signaling her place in the internal order. The child, observing carefully, mirrored the controlled behavior expected of adults. In this small incident, She saw the interplay of control, influence, and perception in microcosm. The ex-nanny also shares insights about how information flowed in the household. Communication was selective, filtered, and carefully timed. Not everyone knew everything, and often, she received instructions with incomplete context. This selective information flow maintained the hierarchy and ensured that influence was concentrated among a few key individuals. Staff had to navigate this carefully, balancing transparency with discretion, compliance with initiative. It was a delicate, high-stakes dance, one she had to learn quickly. Emotional pressure was omnipresent. Even minor errors carried weight, and she describes the constant awareness required to avoid missteps. Staff would subtly signal approval or disapproval, creating an environment in which every decision, even routine ones, could affect relationships and influence. She began keeping mental notes of interactions, patterns, and behavioral cues, recognizing that these insights would later prove critical to understanding the household's true dynamics. She also hints at incidents that later formed the foundation of her shocking revelations. Some moments that appeared innocuous to outsiders were actually loaded with significance, signals of influence, control, and hidden agendas. She teases the audience. You think you're seeing a child's daily routine. But every move, every glance, every small action is embedded in a network of rules, power, and perception. And sometimes, those rules protect secrets no one outside could imagine. By the end of Chapter 6, the audience should understand that the household was not just a family environment. It was a complex ecosystem of influence, control, and subtle power dynamics. They should feel tension, intrigue, and curiosity about how this hierarchy would affect both the ex-nanny and the child. And what hidden truths might emerge from these carefully orchestrated interactions. The chapter closes with a cliffhanger. I thought I knew who really held power in this household. But what I discovered next shattered everything I had assumed, and revealed a truth so extraordinary that it would change how I viewed the child, the staff, and the secrets they guarded. Have you ever noticed a story being told over and over, so convincingly that everyone believes it, only to witness the truth behind the scenes and realize it doesn't match at all? That's exactly what our ex-nanny faced in her weeks inside the household. She quickly learned that the public narrative, the smiling photos, the charming anecdotes, the carefully polished interviews, was only one version of reality. Behind the cameras, behind the smiles, the story was completely different. It began with small inconsistencies. Staff would describe routines one way, yet the child's actual behavior told another story. Photos meant to capture natural moments were staged, sometimes for hours, requiring the child to mimic expressions or actions repeatedly. She recalls a day when Archie was supposed to be learning a simple task. The public narrative would have suggested he mastered it effortlessly, but she watched the painstaking preparation behind the scenes. Repeated demonstrations, carefully guided gestures, and subtle coaching that ensured the final photo looked perfect. It was a polished illusion, and she realized that anyone outside would have no idea of the labor behind it. These discrepancies were everywhere. The household had a way of maintaining appearances at all costs, and the ex-nanny saw firsthand how routines, behaviors, and even the child's personality could be molded for the cameras. She recalls a moment during a play session when a visitor commented on how cheerful and well-behaved Archie seemed. She knew the truth. Hours of preparation and subtle correction had ensured that very moment. To the visitor, it was natural. To her, it was carefully orchestrated. The contradictions extended beyond the child's behavior. Staff would sometimes present conflicting versions of events to maintain their own positions within the hierarchy. The gatekeeper and senior aides often gave instructions that contradicted earlier guidance, leaving her to navigate a maze of conflicting priorities. She describes the mental strain. Every decision required careful consideration of not just the child's needs, but the narratives being maintained by multiple adults with differing motives. One incident illustrates this perfectly. During a routine meal, she noticed that the child's reaction to a new food was not as smooth as staff had reported to parents. Instead of acknowledging the difficulty, senior aides instructed her to present the child as content and engaged. They coached his gestures, adjusted his positioning, and subtly guided his expressions for photos. To outsiders, it appeared seamless, a happy child enjoying his meal. Behind the scenes, she witnessed the tension, manipulation, and control that went into creating that moment. The ex-nanny also observed the psychological impact of these contradictions on the child. Archie quickly learned to anticipate what adults expected of him, often adjusting behavior in real time to satisfy unspoken demands. She describes the emotional complexity of this. A child instinctively navigating a world that demanded perfection, masking frustration or confusion to maintain harmony. She felt both admiration for his adaptability and concern for the subtle pressures placed on someone so young. Humor and spontaneity were carefully regulated. Moments of play had to fit the public narrative, even when private joy would have allowed for genuine laughter and exploration. She recounts small private acts, a whispered joke, a gentle tease, that were allowed only in secrecy. Even then, she had to ensure that these interactions didn't inadvertently disrupt the appearance of harmony. These hidden moments became her secret lifeline, a reminder of the humanity beneath the controlled environment. Conflicting stories also emerged in communication with external contacts. When staff spoke to visitors, the media, or even casual acquaintances, the narrative was tightly managed. Explanations were rehearsed, details were selectively revealed, and the truth often became obscured by layers of presentation. She began documenting these inconsistencies, mentally noting the discrepancies between what was said, what was shown, and what was real. She shares a particularly striking example. A public statement described Archie as thriving in a certain activity, let's say, learning to draw shapes. Behind the scenes, she saw him struggle repeatedly, needing assistance and redirection. The photos and video clips selected for release portrayed him as naturally skilled, while the real learning process, full of trial, error, and effort, was hidden. She recalls thinking, "It wasn't lying, exactly, it was a curated truth." But that distinction matters, because the reality was far more complicated. By this point, she began connecting dots. Repetition of curated narratives, small manipulations, and staff compliance all painted a picture of controlled reality. She realized that the household's public image wasn't accidental. It was carefully constructed, maintained by rules, influence, and selective storytelling. Every photograph, anecdote, and interaction was part of a larger performance, one that ensured the child's image aligned with expectations. The tension grew as she witnessed moments where the child responded differently from the narrative being maintained. He would express frustration, curiosity, or independence in ways that disrupted the story being told. Staff would immediately step in, gently guiding him back into alignment with the expected behavior. She reflects on the emotional weight of this. A child's authenticity subtly corrected, molded, and choreographed for public consumption. She also begins hinting at more shocking observations. Small contradictions, tiny moments that seemed irrelevant at first, gradually built a pattern suggesting deeper truths about the household, the child, and the carefully managed appearances. She teases the audience. What you see in photos and media is only the surface. Behind the smiles, there are stories no one outside could imagine, and I saw them all. By the end of Chapter 7, the audience should feel a growing sense of curiosity and tension. They understand the contrast between the public narrative and private reality, see the subtle pressures on the child, and are primed for revelations that will challenge everything they think they know. The chapter closes with a cliffhanger. I thought I had pieced together the contradictions, the carefully managed appearances, and the invisible rules. But what I discovered next would not just confirm my suspicions. It would reveal a secret so shocking that it could change how the world sees Archie forever. Have you ever felt the need to speak a truth that could shatter everything around you? That's exactly what our ex-nanny experienced, a moment where silence was no longer an option. After weeks of observing, documenting, and living within the complex web of rules, hierarchy, and contradictions, she reached a point where she could no longer keep the secrets she had witnessed. And what she revealed would shock not only staff and insiders, but the entire world. The confession didn't happen all at once. It started quietly, in whispers during breaks, in careful conversations with trusted staff. She tested the waters, gauging reactions and consequences. Each conversation was a risk. Even a hint of disloyalty could have ended her tenure abruptly, or worse, made her complicit in covering up truths she could no longer bear. Yet, she felt a growing urgency. The child's reality, her own conscience, and the public's perception all demanded clarity. She recalls the first moment she truly spoke. Alone in a room, away from cameras and senior aides, she revealed small truths. The orchestrated playtimes, the carefully guided expressions, the contradictions between what was portrayed publicly and what occurred privately. Staff listened in shock, some confirming her observations quietly, others remaining silent, perhaps fearful. But the air was charged, a mixture of relief, anxiety, and anticipation. Her private confessions quickly escalated. She began documenting incidents in detail. The times the child was subtly coached, the way routines were manipulated for appearance, and the psychological pressures applied, not maliciously, but deliberately for control and optics. She recounts moments where aides instructed her on subtle behavioral corrections, moments that at first seemed routine but were now glaringly significant in hindsight. She realized these instructions weren't just about caregiving.